This morning's scripture lesson comes from the Gospel according to St. Mark, chapter 6. It's a short lesson, verses 1 through 6. Now Jesus left that place and came to his hometown, the town of Nazareth, where his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, Jesus began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at Jesus. But Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there, except he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. But he was amazed at their unbelief. Here ends the lesson. May God transform understanding into action. Amen. So, in June of 2012, I placed a phone call down to Florida, where my father-in-law lives. Father-in-law now, he wasn't at the time. And I was a little nervous because he and I had never talked that much. And I was going to tell him that I intended to ask my wife Lindsay to marry me. And I wanted, in some way, direct or indirect, his blessing. Not that I felt that I needed it. We'd always gotten along. But I wanted to honor the tradition in some way and give a little space to that. I knew it was important to him. And so I wanted to just say, hey, this is kind of what we're thinking. We've been talking about getting married, and we think it's about time. And he was customarily silent for a moment. And then he finally said, he didn't say anything that I expected him to say. I expected at least an, "Okay, that sounds good." I expected a, "We love you both, we're so happy for you." I expected some kind of affirmation, which I didn't get. But it wasn't because he didn't want us to get married. It was because he felt that he had something more important to say. And so after a moment of silence, I hear him breathing on the other end of the phone, and then he just says, "Can I tell you something?" And I thought, oh, okay. Sure. What do you want to tell me? He says, "I have a piece of advice for you." I kind of relaxed a little bit. Okay, sounds good. He stops again for a pregnant pause, and he says, "Listen to her." That was all he said. Listen to her. He said, "I've been married, as you know, many years, and the one thing I wish I had learned sooner was to listen to Jackie, listen to my wife, listen to her. Not because she's my daughter, although she is. I love you both, but listen to your wife." And I did what I think most people in that situation would do. I went, "Oh, yeah, no, I understand. Yeah, I know. Yeah, listening, yeah, that's important. Yeah, whatever." I did a very good job listening in that moment. "Oh, yeah, no, I got it. It's fine. Yeah, we communicate great. It'll be fine." He said, "No, I'm telling you, listen to her." Listening is not always easy. And the one thing that it seems, at least in my case, that I react the most to is someone reminding me that I need to listen. Right? Listen, pay attention. "Oh, yeah, no, I know, I got it." Listen to her. Over time, I began to understand that piece of advice a lot more, particularly because I didn't always do a good job listening. And it wasn't because I was outright trying to be dismissive. My wife is brilliant. When she says something, usually it's either because she's thought of it for quite some time and she's decided to share, because that tends to be her personality type. She mulls things over, and then once the plan is formulated, she presents it to you fully formed, whereas I tend to just throw ideas out, as you can tell, right? I tend to be a little more slapdash in how I think about things, and my wife is very considered. So you would think it would be easy for me to listen to her, because I know that quite often, usually in fact, my wife is right. Listen to her. But because I see her every day, and because she sees me every day, and because after a while you get into a routine, I'm not sure if it's because we take each other for granted, although I know couples can do that sometimes, but the reality is you find yourself, despite what you might have promised to your future father-in-law, you find yourself not listening. And then you miss something. You miss an instruction that was important, and your wife, she's great, so she just kind of says, yeah, I know. It's the closest thing to an I told you so, right? Yeah, no, I know. No, I knew about that. Yeah, no, I know. Listen. I didn't fully understand the value of listening when we first got married. I'm not sure I fully understand it now, but over time, it's grown in its importance in our relationship. I've seen how most of our problems can be solved if whoever isn't doing the listening can suddenly listen. And guess what? It's usually me. She's a really good communicator. She's not to put you on the spot. She's really good at listening, and she's really good at mirroring, and I'm not. I tend to be the kind of person who gets an idea in my head and sort of thinks I have it fully formed, and then go, okay, cool, I'm good. Have you thought about this? Yeah, I thought about that. Have you really thought about it? Yeah, sure. It's easy to be dismissive. So this morning, Jesus experiences that for himself. Jesus returns to his hometown after what has been so far a fairly successful, if controversial, ministry. And so you would expect that someone who had become a bit of a celebrity would be welcomed back into his hometown with open arms. But instead, Jesus is stunned by their unbelief. I don't know if you caught that line at the very end. He was surprised by the extent of their unbelief. Now, if you hold to the idea that Jesus is literally fully God and fully man, the idea that Jesus would be surprised, the idea that Jesus is caught off guard by their lack of faith, and even more importantly, their lack of listening to who he said he was. The problem with passages like this, and I've talked about this before, I have to come up with a name for this because I feel like we notice it a lot when we come up against these iconic passages. They seem to always be used in a very cartoony way, passages like this, to remind us that Jesus is so much cooler than everybody else, and that Jesus is so much smarter than everybody else, and no one in Jesus' own time understood him. Right? That's become the cliche. Well, the scribes and Pharisees didn't understand him. His own disciples didn't understand him. His own family, his own friends, his own neighborhood, his own community didn't understand him. But it runs deeper than just Jesus being really awesome and they're choosing to ignore him. It runs deeper than that. It's this bigger question of seeing someone over and over again for many years, as they allude to in the scripture. Well, don't we know his family? Isn't he the son of the carpenter? Didn't he grow up among us? And in that moment, taking Jesus for granted such that they were closed to whatever message he might have to share. To the point where they were so closed off, he couldn't even work the miracles that he intended to work. The scriptures, in a rare moment of kind of dismissive hand-waving, say, well, he didn't really do anything, except for he healed a couple of sick people. The scriptures don't really go into a lot of detail, but the implicit message there is that Jesus would have done something a lot bigger and better had they been a little more receptive, had they listened. And listened not to this stranger who it seems that everyone was listening to, but to this friend, to this neighbor, to this kid who grew up with them. What is it about the people who are closest to us that makes it hardest sometimes for us to listen to them. Have you ever been in a situation, this has happened in my marriage plenty of times, your partner says something, you say, oh yeah, that sounds like a really good idea, but it doesn't quite hit home for you until a third party says it. Someone outside the relationship says, hey, have you thought about this? And you go, oh yeah, that's pretty good. Well, if someone else has mentioned it, it must be a good idea. Why is it that we're still so reluctant? Why does it take someone that we don't know? Why are we resistant to allowing ourselves to be instructed by the people who, in many cases, know us best? There's probably a pride element to it. I think in my case it certainly is true. Because nobody, I think, and this is especially true in my case, I don't like to think that I'm wrong about something, so it becomes really difficult for me to entertain doubts once I've gotten an idea in my head and I'm sort of attached to it. It's a challenge for me to get outside of that box again and be free. I don't know what it is for others, but it's a common enough thing, and Jesus experiences it firsthand. A couple weeks ago, I talked about the value of speaking up, but here's the flip side. Prophets can only be prophets if and when they have an audience. And prophets, if you look back through the history of the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament, if you look back through all of that history, there really never was a prophet who was well received. Rarely, if ever, do prophets get carried through the city streets on people's shoulders because they're so excited about the message that the prophet has to share. No, it's always kind of doom and gloom. Usually by the time it's bad enough for God to send a prophet along, it's because things have really gotten out of hand and it's time to make some changes. So when the prophets speak out, do the people respond well or do the people respond poorly? They respond poorly often. Why is it that those who are best equipped to know us, as the prophets knew Israel, as Jesus knew Nazareth, as Lindsay knows me, why is it that we are so reluctant just to stop and to listen? One of the things I've noticed, particularly as politics has gotten so out of hand lately in terms of how we talk about things, the mudslinging that we throw. None of us wants to listen to anybody else anymore. Everything is incredibly one-sided, to the point, on both sides, by the way, although I know that's a loaded phrase. Everything is so divisive, and it seems like everyone wants to speak, but few of us want to listen. If I can just speak my truth, if I can just open my mouth with a big enough audience, the number of ministers, myself included sometimes, who think that way, if I just get a platform big enough, I will change the world. But part of changing the world is not just knowing how to speak, it's knowing how to listen. Because if we don't know how to listen, prophets will literally knock on our doors. Prophets will literally come into our hometowns and speak truth into our lives. Prophets may be members of our family. Prophets may be those we love. And we miss God's act of prophecy in that moment. God speaking truth into our lives. What a powerful and frightening thing. That any one of us at any moment could be used by God to speak truth into our world, and that it may alienate us from those who love us the most. And I think that's why it's important to listen. Not just because it's good to be consistent and it's good not to be a hypocrite, although I think that's true too. It's good not to be a hypocrite. But at the same time, one of the reasons why it's so beneficial for us to learn how to listen is because, particularly if we have to say something unpopular or difficult, if we've ever been in that position where we've had to say something and we're not sure how it's going to be well received, have you ever had an audience with someone who turns out is very gracious despite the fact that you're talking about something pretty uncomfortable? And that relief you feel when they've really heard you, when they really listened? How much you can appreciate that, whew, that went so much better than what I thought. That's why listening becomes important. Because any one of us at any moment could be a prophet. And because if we're stubborn, if we're dismissive, if we say, no, I got it all figured out, No, I'll wing it. No, I know. If that's ever our attitude, oh, it's just Jesus, the kid who grew up down the street. I think of all of the truths that I've encountered in this congregation in the just under a year that I've been with you as a community. I've watched us build a new momentum that's really awesome to see. I mean, summer attendance is fantastic this year. And attendance in general has been up, and the congregation is engaged, and that's wonderful. And the reason that that's possible is because we have many prophets in our midst. And you don't prophesy to all the same things. You don't all speak the same truths. You all come from different perspectives, different parts of the Lowell community, different parts even of this church. You all see different things. You're all prophets in your own way. But if each of us is only ever speaking out loud into an echo chamber and no one is ever listening, if everyone has a voice but no one has ears, how do we learn from each other? And better yet, how do we learn from God? I'm reminded of the prophet running from the king. The prophet runs from the king and goes hiding in the hills and waits on God for a sign. There's an earthquake, but God wasn't in the earthquake. There was a wind, but God wasn't in the wind. And finally, when it seemed that all hell and earth had broken loose, suddenly there's a voice. And it's quiet, and you have to strain to hear it. And it was in that voice that God spoke. So my challenge for you this week and always is, just as you're finding your prophetic voice, just as you're finding the thing that you need to speak life into, think also about how you use your ears. Are we really listening to one another? And if not, what are we missing? The voice of God is always present. But sometimes we have to stop speaking in order to hear it. Amen.